John Mercer, a war veteran haunted by loss, faced relentless hostility from Marcus Daniels, who claimed ownership of a forgotten riverbank and tried to drive him away. Marcus's threats and sabotage made John's quest feel hopeless, turning his search for meaning into a battle against injustice. Yet John's persistence and Ranger's unshakable loyalty led them to uncover an ancient chest that changed everything. But just listen to how shocking the turn of events in this drama was, and why justice ultimately prevailed. John Mercer had been walking for hours before he even realized where he was. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and wet earth, and the light of a pale October morning filtered softly through the bare branches. At 48, John was lean and weathered, his face lined with years that had nothing to do with age alone. Since returning from Afghanistan, he had carried more than scars. He carried memories that no silence could erase. A battered backpack hung over his shoulder, its straps frayed and worn from long days of travel. At his side trotted Ranger, a loyal German shepherd with eyes that seemed to understand far more than John would ever say. Ranger had been with him since before his last deployment, a steadfast companion who had stayed through nights of restless sleep and the heavy weight of solitude. Together, they had wandered small towns, highways, and forgotten country roads, searching, though John wasn't certain what. That morning, they found themselves on the edge of a river running quietly through a forgotten corner of West Virginia. The riverbank was untouched by any sign of modern life. Fallen logs lay scattered, moss coated the stones, and reeds swayed softly in the slow current. John lowered his pack and sank to sit beside the water, leaning back against an old oak. Ranger stepped ahead briefly, sniffing the damp earth, before coming back and settling near his feet. John closed his eyes, letting the sound of the river fill the silence. His mind drifted, as it often did, to the past, to friends he had lost, and to the life he once thought he had. But his quiet was broken when he noticed Ranger standing still, staring toward the water. The dog's ears were alert, his stance tense. "Come on, boy," John said softly, tugging gently at the leash. "Time to move." Ranger didn't budge. John tugged again, more insistently, but Ranger stayed rooted, eyes fixed on the old dock that jutted into the river. The dock was weather-worn, its wood dark and slick with moss, and it looked as if it had been abandoned for decades. Something about it seemed out of place in the quiet wilderness. John stood, brushing dirt from his pants. He called Ranger again, but the dog turned his head only slightly, returning his attention to the dock. John frowned. "What is it, boy?" he asked, stepping closer. Ranger's growl was low and cautious, not threatening, but enough to make John pause. The veteran crouched at the edge of the water. Something caught his eye, a faint glimmer beneath the surface, shimmering in the filtered morning light. He reached down and brushed aside a clump of wet leaves and silt, revealing a dark shape hidden just under the waterline. His fingers lingered there for a moment, but the cold pulled him back. John's heart began to quicken. Was it just stubbornness keeping Ranger here? Or was there something else? Something waiting to be uncovered? He had wandered many forgotten places, but this riverbank had a strange pull, a quiet insistence that he stay. Ranger, steady and unwavering, seemed to share the same instinct. For a long moment, John stood in silence, listening to the sound of water lapping at the dock and watching the dog's eyes fixed on the same point. A sense of intrigue settled deep inside him. He didn't know yet what it meant, but he knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. There was something about this place, something neither man nor dog could explain, and somehow John knew it would change everything. From the moment Ranger refused to leave that moss-covered dock, John Mercer's life began to change. It wasn't just curiosity that pulled him back to the riverbank. It was something deeper, something he couldn't name. Every morning, without fail, John found himself walking the worn dirt trail back to the same spot, Ranger trotting beside him as if guided by instinct. For John, the visits were more than exploration. They were a thread pulling him out of a year spent drifting through towns and motels, carrying only his backpack and his memories. Since returning from service, John had felt untethered, living without a real reason to move forward. But at this forgotten riverbank, there was a pull stronger than emptiness. He felt an unspoken connection, as though this place had been waiting for him. For Ranger, it was instinct. For John, it was becoming something like hope. Each day, they approached the river, the air shifting subtly as they neared the dock. Ranger never wandered far from the water's edge, ears alert, watching every ripple. John began to sit for hours, leaning on his knees, watching the currents and wondering about the glimmers beneath the surface. Sometimes the sound of rushing water seemed to speak to him, but their presence did not go unnoticed. Marcus Daniels was the first to confront him. Marcus was a rugged man, his face weathered like old leather, eyes sharp with suspicion. A lifelong fisherman in the area, Marcus had been using the riverbank for years, quietly, without interference. But Marcus had a grudge. He didn't trust strangers. Worse, he didn't trust veterans. When he first saw John and Ranger by the dock, Marcus's voice rang with warning. "You don't belong here," Marcus said one morning, his voice low but firm. "This bank isn't for wanderers." "Stay away?" John had nodded politely at first, but Marcus kept showing up, sometimes just sitting in the shade of a tree nearby, watching with narrowed eyes. His visits grew more direct, verbal challenges, sharp words aimed to unsettle John. Marcus claimed the land was his, accusing John of wasting time chasing shadows. His tone was heavy with suspicion, as if he believed John was hiding something. Still, John returned day after day, not out of defiance, but because he felt a responsibility to Ranger. The dog's persistence had become part of John's own mission. He thought of Ranger not just as a companion, but as a reminder of why he needed something to believe in. This place was giving him purpose. It wasn't just about uncovering whatever lay beneath the dock anymore. It was about answering something deeper in himself. John knew he couldn't turn away, even as the tension with Marcus grew. Every visit brought a silent challenge, not just from Marcus, but from the river itself. One chilly morning, Marcus stepped closer than ever, leaning on a fishing pole as he spoke. "You're wasting your time, Mercer," he said. "That riverbank belongs to me. You've got no right here." John looked out over the water, then back at Ranger, who stood unmoving beside him. He said nothing. He felt a quiet warmth of resolve building inside him. It wasn't about ownership or argument. It was about compassion. For Ranger, who seemed to know more than John did. For himself, who was seeking something lost. Every step back toward the riverbank strengthened his resolve. Compassion wasn't weakness. It was what drove him to keep returning. And deep down, John knew there was more at stake than just the stubbornness of a dog or the claim of a fisherman. There was a story in the riverbank, and it was calling him. The river waited, and John was listening. Weeks bled into months, and the riverbank became John Mercer's world. Every morning before sunrise, he rose and walked the narrow trail back to the moss-covered dock, Ranger padding silently beside him. The days were slow, measured in small discoveries, fragments of driftwood, bent nails, pieces of rusted metal. But beneath those fragments lay something John could not name, a quiet promise that kept him returning. The work took a toll. John's shoulders ached constantly, his knees stiffened, and his hands were raw from digging through years of silt and sediment. His savings dwindled faster than he could replace them. Meals became sparse, and the nights brought sharper pain, both in body and in spirit. Ranger stayed at his side through it all, never faltering, never losing his watchful gaze over the riverbank. But trouble was never far behind. Marcus Daniels, the fisherman who had once warned John away, became more aggressive. His hostility no longer hid behind casual remarks. It became action. One morning, John arrived to find a section of his tools damaged, the blade of his spade bent beyond repair. Later, Marcus was there again, leaning against his fishing rod with a scowl as if daring John to return. John ignored the provocation. For him, the riverbank was no longer just a place to explore. It was a mission. Ranger's insistence grounded him, and the river itself seemed to whisper a challenge. But each day, exhaustion pressed harder until doubt crept in. One evening, after a long day of digging with bare hands and finding nothing but mud, John collapsed beside the dock. His breath came in ragged pulls, his body trembling from strain. Ranger lay beside him, head low, staring intently into the water. The air was cold, smelling of autumn leaves and wet stone. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft rush of the river. John thought about turning away. His clothes were torn, his tools destroyed. What if this was madness? A stubborn fantasy? He pictured the life he might return to, drifting alone through motels and diners, no direction, no purpose. The thought was heavy. Despair began to press around him like the dark water under the dock. He closed his eyes for a moment, leaning against the old oak. Ranger shifted beside him, his paw pressing gently against John's hand. Then, more insistently, the dog lifted his paw and pressed it into the water. John opened his eyes. There was something there, a shimmer, a faint metallic glimmer that caught the light and vanished again as the ripples moved. Ranger's posture stiffened, his gaze fixed. Something buried beneath the riverbed was calling. Without hesitation, John rose. The exhaustion that weighed on him seemed to fall away in that instant. He waded into the shallow current, the cold biting at his calves. His hands sank into the silt, pulling away mud and roots. His breaths came hard, the air filled with the smell of wet earth and river minerals. Then his fingers touched something solid. His heart stuttered in his chest. He worked with renewed urgency, the minutes stretching long under the weight of discovery. Finally, he pulled free a shape that was unmistakable. A chest, worn with age, its surface covered in rust, but still whole. John stood there in silence, water dripping from his arms. Ranger sat beside him, eyes bright and attentive. John's breath came heavy and uneven. This wasn't just a relic. It wasn't just an object lost to time. It was proof that persistence could outlast doubt, that pain could lead somewhere unexpected, that trust in the struggle, no matter how quiet or lonely, could lead to something extraordinary. John held the chest for a moment, feeling the weight not just in his hands, but in his chest as well. Somewhere deep inside, he knew his life had changed forever. The chest was heavier than John expected, its rusted surface rough against his palms. He carried it back to the moss-covered bank, where Ranger sat quietly beside him, eyes fixed on the water, as if guarding the secret they had uncovered together. When John opened the chest, light from the late afternoon sun caught something deep inside: gold coins, their surfaces dulled by years beneath the river. Alongside them lay a bundle, a weathered leather-bound diary, and a set of brittle maps, their edges curled and stained. The air around the riverbank seemed to hold its breath. John set the chest on the ground and opened the diary. The handwriting was cramped, filled with careful, deliberate strokes. It belonged to a miner named Samuel Hargrove, who had lived decades earlier. Samuel wrote of hardship, loss, and a dangerous choice, a choice to hide wealth deep in the valley rather than allow it to be seized. His words were filled with courage, secrecy, and the quiet determination to protect something important. The maps were his guide, pointing toward forgotten landmarks scattered through the hills. John held the diary close, feeling the weight of the miner's story. This was more than treasure. It was a legacy. It was proof that survival sometimes demands sacrifice, and courage comes from guarding what matters most. Ranger leaned against him, quiet and steady, as though understanding every word without hearing it. But not everyone saw it that way. Marcus Daniels appeared at the bank as if drawn by fate. His face was set, his stance rigid. Without ceremony, he stepped forward and reached for the chest. "That belongs to me," Marcus said. His voice was low, edged with anger and entitlement. John stood in his place, hands on the chest. He looked Marcus in the eye. "It doesn't belong to either of us," he said firmly. "It belongs to everyone who needs a place to heal." Marcus hesitated, the air thick with tension. But John held his ground. He didn't need the money for himself. He wanted something greater, to restore the riverbank, to give it back as a sanctuary for veterans and others who had lost their way. This was no longer about gold. It was about hope. Word spread through the town. John gathered support. He donated the contents of the chest to a veteran support foundation, and with the help of neighbors and friends, began transforming the forgotten riverbank into something living again. Trails were cleared, benches built, and small gardens planted. Ranger became the heart of it all, a quiet guardian for every visitor who came seeking peace. The riverbank became more than a place. It became a symbol of persistence, of trust, of the courage to continue even when hope feels far away. John watched it grow, knowing that his years of searching, of struggle, had not been in vain. One late afternoon, John stood beside the dock, Ranger at his side. The river moved slowly, sunlight turning its surface into gold. John thought of the months he had spent here, of pain, of doubt, of quiet perseverance. He thought of Marcus, of the miner's diary, and of every moment that had led him here. He realized something profound. The true treasure wasn't gold, nor maps, nor secrets buried under silt. It was the ability to turn loss into meaning, to turn despair into hope, to reclaim something more precious than wealth, a purpose. Ranger nudged his hand. John smiled, placing the diary into a small case to preserve it. Together, they stood in silence, two souls bound by more than friendship. They were bound by a journey of persistence. The riverbank, once forgotten, now pulsed with life. It was a place of healing, a place of memory, a place of strength. John's battle had not only uncovered treasure, it had reclaimed his soul. And in doing so, it became a quiet inspiration for everyone who walked its path.